Bread makes you fat.
Bread makes you fat?
Have you ever had a film that you resonated with so deeply that no matter how many times you watch it, you always feel like you're absolutely swept up in it? For me, that film is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. As far as my introduction to the film, I think we first rented it from Blockbuster along with a few other weeklies. I know now in retrospect that it had a cinema release here in Australia, but I think it flew under the radar for me at the time. Anyway, as I alluded to, I absolutely loved it, and it remains in my Letterboxd top 4. I later revisited the film when Netflix came to Australia in 2015, and since then I've watched it probably more than any other live-action film. I've shown it to multiple friends, I've rewatched it alone however many times since, and all this to say, it's genuinely one of the best films I've seen. The film was co-written by Edgar Wright along with Michael Bacall, the pair of them adapting Brian Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim series of graphic novels. Scott Pilgrim, the film, coming off the back of Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy. And it truly has one of the most fully realised senses of identity in this comic booky, melancholy, but otherworldly sort of way. The sound mixing, the editing style, and those transitions especially. The film itself follows our titular character Scott Pilgrim as he goes on a journey of self-discovery, all the while beginning a budding romance with Ramona Flowers. Ramona being what has since become the blueprint for your manic pixie dream girl archetype. And along the way, Scott has to battle her 7 evil exes. All of this stemming from Brian's appreciation for the indie group Plumtree, and in particular their song titled Scott Pilgrim. Though Scott, names aside, is very much based off Brian's lived experience as an early 20-something living in Canada who'd recently started dating an American girl, had a pretty ever-present ex-partner, a roommate who he shared a bed with, along with a sister Stacey, and was part of a band. Not only that, but in what is very much a cute little detail I only learnt in researching for this, the film and comics are both set in the neighbourhood Brian grew up in. Now getting back to the actual events of the film itself, in case you haven't seen it, after encountering her in a dreamscape, Scott falls absolutely head over heels for Ramona Flowers. And like I said, he has to fight and defeat her 7 evil exes in order to be with her, all the while competing in a battle of the bands and navigating what is a pretty crook sort of relationship with a high schooler. And while it'd be nice to put this aside, Scott begins the film an incredibly unlikable character. He's an avoidant, unapologetic crook bloke who's dating a high schooler at 22. And the arc the character goes on sees him go from that to just a pretty alright boyfriend to Ramona over its 1 hour 52 minute runtime. And in that, every single element, the high school relationship aside, is just such a treat. Despite all the research I'm putting into this one, I'm not checking, but I'd like to believe that the casting director was given some kind of award for this. If they didn't, lie to me in the comments please. This film could not work without Michael Cera or Mary Elizabeth Winstead. They are Scott Pilgrim and Ramona Flowers. And that's not even to get into the supporting cast. Now, to get into the supporting cast, let's just rattle off a few names. Aubrey Plaza, Kieran Culkin, Brie Larson, Chris Evans, and a whole bunch more. There's not a single actor who's not giving their absolute all, and Chris Evans especially plays another crook guy in the most charming way imaginable. As far as set pieces go, they're all so distinct from one another while feeling very consistent with this very otherworldly but dreary world. It's very shonen anime. To get into the actual play-by-play of the plot, we'll speed through that and then we'll get into what really elevates the film outside of the actual series of events. Like I said, Scott is in his early 20s and doesn't have a lot going on outside of being in a band, dates a high schooler, knives, and shares a bed with his roommate. This being the state he finds himself in when he meets the American Amazon delivery person, Ramona, who he then more or less stalks at a party, following seeing her in a dream he had. Then after meeting her, he totally forgets about knives, chooses to avoid a very difficult conversation in favour of being a bit crook again, and pursues Ramona. And here's where we get into the first handful of Ramona's exes that act as a sort of introduction to what the film will be moving forward. Now, during their first night of the Battle of the Bands, the first of Ramona's 7 evil exes rocks up and wants to have a punch-on with Scott. And then this leading to him, I guess, killing her ex Matthew, as well as him leaving Knives, who, instead of realising Scott's a bad guy, decides Ramona is more or less the devil and blames her. This is then followed up by Scott fighting famous actor Chris Evans, who's her second ex. Not defeating him in a traditional sense, but instead tricks him into doing a sick grind. And then we've got Todd, who, especially after my initial watch, I was just obsessed with. Him having vegan powers, which I still find charming to this day. Him then being stripped of those powers by the vegan police after Scott gives him half and half.
This ex-boyfriend's thing is messing with my head. Exes. Why do you keep saying that?
Then we get into the fourth ex, Roxy, who absolutely hands it to Scott before Ramona gets involved. And following that, Scott continues to be a crook bloke, blowing up at Ramona, who rightfully leaves him. After that, Scott goes back to the Battle of the Bands, and it just so happens the next band he's competing against is made up of Kyle and Ken, who both date Ramona. Scott defeating them and gaining an extra life, which will come in handy shortly.
What are you doing? Getting a life.
While all this is going on, Ramona ends up back with her 7th ex and the leader of the League of Evil Exes, Gideon. Scott's band accepting a record deal with Gideon, prompting Scott to quit the band for a bit. Scott then decides to fight Gideon, unlocking the power of the love sword.
Scott earned the power of love.
Knives gets involved, her and Ramona fight a bit, Scott dies, Ramona's revealed to have been under mind control, then Scott uses that second life, gains the power of the self-respect sword.
Scott earned the power of self-respect.
Fights and beats Gideon, freeing Ramona, but before a happy ending, Scott has to battle his inner demons more or less.
Mega Scott.
But instead of that, he and his dark self just get along pretty well. That and Knives accepts the breakup, and Scott and Ramona get back together, ending the film. Now, if you haven't seen the film, I'd be curious what your thoughts are based off of what is a very stripped back, possibly incoherent play-by-play. I'm not sure where I'm pulling this from, but I remember that the initial version of the film had Scott and Knives ending up together, but test audiences weren't so keen on the ending, so they had Ramona and Scott end up together instead. Some aspects of the film certainly feel like they were leading up to that original ending, but I'm very glad that wasn't how it ended. Let's move on to the elements that really elevate the film. Somehow this 2010s film, quite literally a 2010 release, managed to not only successfully bring visual language from comics and TV shows into a live-action film, but blend them into it in a, not quite a seamless, but an incredibly visually striking and gorgeous way. It's very animated. And with that, like a video game or comic, we see a shocking amount of text on screen throughout the entire runtime of the film, right from the opening narration. It starts off alleviating a lot of character introduction by having what is more or less a character bio on screen all over the place. That and so many sort of comic book panel style tidbits that add so much depth to what already feels like a very lived in world. All this escalating when these boxes are replaced by those 2D action lines along with much more tangible text. Characters end up literally interacting with text on screen. Now for those of you who have seen the Cornetto trilogy, that being Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz and World's End, you'd be well familiar with his pretty distinct way of throwing a film together, particularly his scene transitions. For those of you who aren't, I highly recommend them. If nothing else, go watch Hot Fuzz. All this to say, Scott Pilgrim takes it to another level entirely. Scenes jump from one to another in such a creative, seamless way that so directly links one scene to another, whether it be Scott and his sister talking on the phone, initially in split screen, only for the scene to pan right, following the onomatopoeia going across to Knife's school bell ringing.
Can I get back to you on that?
I do not want to be here at all.
All these several incredibly smooth transitions between locations during Scott's date with Knives, whether it be people, clothes, or a reverse shot, we get snippets of their day together in all these various locations while still being one very ironically seamless scene. And to a lesser but still incredibly immersive degree, that sense of blending location and time together continues throughout the film. It really giving the film this sort of dreamy feeling, really mirroring Scott's initial introduction to Ramona. Final thoughts on the film before we move on to what I'm going to call something of a legacy sequel series. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a bit of a belated coming-to-age story. Scott growing out of this stagnant stage in his early 20s, going from crook bloke to possibly a decent boyfriend, at least one with a willingness to try and a sense of self-respect. Now jumping forward 13 years, we have 2023's animated series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. We won't be going over this one in quite so much depth, but I feel this would be an incomplete video without talking about it. And this one's pretty special to me. When this first released, I raced home and waited by the TV until Netflix would let me watch it. And I watched the entire thing in one go and wow, it totally captured me in the same way the film always has, but improves on it with just about every bit of hindsight you could imagine. Also, when I finished renovating my current home, it is the first thing I popped on the TV when I moved in. The series massively elevates this already pretty amazing world, adding so much depth to its characters, and generally it's just a beautiful show, both in its writing and visuals. Now I went into the series thinking it'd more or less be a fleshed out retelling of the film, and it certainly starts off that way up until the fight with Matthew, and wow, I really didn't see it coming. Matthew wins, well, sort of. And with that, Scott really does take off. He's out of there for most of the series runtime. Instead, Ramona really shines, with her more than filling Scott's shoes as the series protagonist. That and it shines such a spotlight on the supporting cast, particularly the League, with Ramona having to come to terms with her past relationships, the people who she split up with, and her, and more often than not, her exes, healing and growing through this.
All I wanted was for you to see me! I'm sorry.
To wrap things up, I began work on this video to tie into the Scott Pilgrim EX game that I thought was coming out soon, but turns out it's been out for months. I want to go play that now, and once I have, I'm going to go read the comic for myself. If I can give you one suggestion to end things on, it'd be to either watch the film for the first time, revisit it, and or watch the series. I'd suggest watching the film before you watch the show. Thanks for watching.
Hello again.